I used to live in Fairview, Montana, and believe me when I tell you, you couldn't ask for a more beautiful landscape. Sometimes just walking out the door felt like stepping into a painting. Despite this inherent beauty, there are many dangerous things in Montana that many people may not realize, such as bull moose charging your car, driving between towns because of an emergency due to engine trouble, and how your lungs can freeze if it gets cold enough. Most of these dangers can be prepared for and mitigated mainly due to an exceptional state police force and rescue services. But it would be an error not to mention that people in Montana, well, they're just built differently. Folks are tough here, and people are a lot more open to lending a helping hand to a stranger in Montana. After all, you never know when your life might be on the line. I was about 9 years old. My stepdad was a trucker and often spent weeks away from home, whereas my mom worked the night shift as a respiratory therapist at the hospital. I was a rather lonely kid. Montana doesn't have very many people, and my class was incredibly small. I had just moved to town the year before and had difficulty wedging myself into the existing friends group. I'll leave it at that. When my parents did both have long stretches of days off, they tried to make up for the lost time it would take me camping. As a result, I've seen many of Montana's state and national parks. And holy crow, you have to check these things out. Just don't stay the night. On one of these camping trips, we went to the Glacier National Park. The park is massive, spanning over 1,500 square miles of deep wilderness with additional vast stretches of untouched nature preserved around it. The park's northern half is blanketed in thick pine forest spotted with lakes and crisscrossed with streams. The imposing Chief Mountain dominates the southern half, a snow-capped and glacier-bearing behemoth of a mountain. There are all sorts of wildlife, from bears to wolves, elk, moose, deer, raccoons, foxes. If you've seen it in a fairy tale picture book, it's probably there. Man, is it gorgeous, except for the mosquitoes. There's a common joke in Montana that mosquitoes are the state bird. They aren't quite that big, admittedly, but they are more than the size of a quarter. But think about it. These mosquitoes have to punch through the thick hide of bears and moose. They are precisely gentle feeders. Anyway, we were set to camp there for 2 nights. My stepdad was hell-bent on fishing to his heart's content, while my mom mostly just wanted to lounge about and watch animals. I was more interested in exploring, but it was Montana, and being well-warned and thoroughly scared of the potential predators in such a place, I mostly stayed put and fished with my dad. Things went well that first day. The fish seemed to be biting the bait every 10 minutes or so. I must have had a good spot, or maybe just really good luck. I've never caught so many fish in my life. We only kept 2 to fry up that night for dinner. My mom was in a good mood too, since she had seen a herd of elk come down through the stream to drink. We cooked our fish as the sun got low, and I listened to them tell stories about their childhoods under what would be the most spectacular night sky I had ever seen. I soon got tired and decided to go to my tent. I quickly fell asleep, and that's when things began to get weird. I woke up suddenly, opened my eyes, and saw nothing but pitch blackness in front of me. I was startled pretty bad, but then I remembered where I was and laughed at myself a little bit. But then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound coming from just outside of my tent near the opening flap. I remembered freezing and just listening. It must be a tree. It has to be a tree. But we didn't camp near any of the trees because my mom thought pine cones might poke a hole in the tent. Now, there are maybe other explanations that could have been figured out by some sort of a more rational person, but for 8-year-old me, if it wasn't a tree making that sound, I didn't know what it was. It could be anything like a boogeyman. My freezing instinct went into full gear now. My chest was so tight, I could barely breathe. It felt like every muscle had been flexed and locked into place. I listened for what must have been a few minutes, not moving, not making a sound. Then everything just stopped. The next thing I heard was a single footstep, as if somebody had shifted their stance directly outside my tent. Now at first, this was kind of reassuring. I thought, oh, it must be my mom or dad checking in on me. I still felt shaky and excited, but I could finally move with that rationalization. I crawled towards the opening flap. For some reason, it was still quiet, and I was trying to be as silent as possible. Some deeper, intuitive part of me knew something was wrong, even if my rational brain was trying to shrug it off. I reached up to grab the zipper. The small metal eyelet touched my fingers no more than once before I heard something more. Whatever was outside my tent, a deep, guttural breath. I froze again, but this time in a more awkward position, with one arm raised, supporting myself like a tripod. I noticed my discomfort pretty much immediately, but could not shift slightly to unjam my wrist from its overstretched position below me. The breathing turned into a snuffle, then a snort. It was then sniffing and coming closer to the horrifyingly thin and flimsy, half-centered, thick fabric separating me from whatever creature was out there. Whether it be a bear, a wolf, whatever. I began to shake all over. Then I heard a laugh. It was deep, but for that shining moment, I knew it must be my dad trying to scare me. I became relieved, hysterical, and furious all at once. I ripped the zipper down, pulled up the flap, shrieked and peed myself, and started screaming some more. The thing I saw standing outside, the black and shadowed hole of my meager shelter, was without a doubt not my dad. It was hunching over my tent entrance, standing on two legs. It was covered in fur. I couldn't tell the color in the dark, but its eyes were. Its eyes were definitely enormous. If I had to guess and try to put a color to it, it definitely had some sort of amber tint to it. The wolf-like head pulled its thick lips back with enormous fangs showing. Its pointed ears flattened against the back of its skull. It began to growl, sending ripples of sharp panic through the trembling body of myself. Me screaming intensified and got louder. One long, hairy arm began to reach out through the opening of my tent, a grasping, clawed hand reaching ever closer. A loud, sudden gunshot rang out, followed immediately by a cracking sound a little ways down the creature's right. The beast whirled to its left so fast I swear it was a blur. Now I could see its back. A long, fluffy tail spouted out from the end of the beast's spine. I saw its foot enter my field of view, and saw that it was anatomically very similar to a wolf's. Then I heard my dad start yelling, and another gunshot rang out. The creature again moved so fast I could barely see it. Within a split second, it was gone into the branches of the woods. My dad ran over to my tent, looked inside for about 1 second to see if I was alive, and then turned back to the forest, his .50 cal revolver still drawn. I had never before seen him look so terrified. I started to cry and ask over and over what the heck that thing was, but I don't think we'll ever know. My parents tell me it was a bear, but I think it was something much different. We had arrived at Glacier National Park early in the morning, the sunlight just beginning to filter through the dense canopy of pine trees. The drive had been long but exhilarating, the anticipation building as we left the small town behind and ventured deeper into the wilderness. My stepdad, Ray, was in high spirits, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of the fishing expedition ahead. My mom, Linda, seemed more relaxed than usual, her usual night shifts at the hospital replaced by the tranquil beauty of the park. As we set up camp near a serene lake, I couldn't help but marvel at the sheer magnificence of the landscape. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the towering pines and the distant, snow-capped peaks of Chief Mountain. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and the distant calls of wildlife. It felt like we had stepped into another world, one untouched by the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Ray wasted no time in setting up his fishing gear, his enthusiasm infectious. He handed me a small fishing rod, and we walked to the edge of the lake, our boots crunching on the pebbled shore. The water was so clear that I could see the fish swimming just beneath the surface, their silvery bodies glinting in the sunlight. I cast my line, feeling a thrill of excitement as I watched the bobber float on the water. Linda, meanwhile, had settled into a camping chair with a pair of binoculars, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of wildlife. She had always loved watching animals, and the park was teeming with them. It wasn't long before she spotted a herd of elk making their way to the water's edge to drink. She called out to us, and we all watched in awe as the majestic creatures moved gracefully through the trees, their antlers gleaming in the sunlight. As the day wore on, we caught several fish, each one a small victory that brought a smile to Ray's face. We only kept 2, deciding to release the rest back into the lake. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. We gathered around the campfire, the smell of frying fish mingling with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Ray and Linda shared stories of their childhoods, their voices filled with nostalgia and laughter. I listened, enraptured by their tales of adventure and mischief, feeling a sense of warmth and belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring up at the night sky. It was the most spectacular sight I had ever seen, a vast expanse of stars twinkling like diamonds against the inky blackness. I felt small and insignificant in the face of such beauty, but also profoundly connected to the world around me. It was a feeling I would never forget. Eventually, I grew tired and decided to retire to my tent. The day had been long, and my eyelids were heavy with sleep. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the warmth and comfort enveloping me as I closed my eyes. I drifted off to sleep, my dreams filled with the sights and sounds of the wilderness. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I was suddenly jolted awake. My eyes flew open, and I was met with complete darkness. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. But then I remembered. The camping trip, the lake, the tent. I let out a breath, trying to calm my racing heart. It was then that I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound coming from just outside my tent near the opening flap. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, straining to listen. It must be a tree, I told myself. It has to be a tree. But then I remembered that we hadn't camped near any trees, specifically to avoid the pine cones that could poke a hole in the tent. I lay there, every muscle tensed, listening intently. The scratching continued, a steady, unnerving sound that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Fear gripped me, paralyzing me in place. I told myself it must be something harmless, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The scratching suddenly stopped, and I heard a single footstep, as if someone had shifted their stance directly outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I thought it might be my mom or Ray checking on me, but something didn't feel right. I crawled towards the opening flap, trying to be as silent as possible. Some deeper, intuitive part of me knew something was wrong, even if my rational brain was trying to shrug it off. I reached up to grab the zipper, my fingers trembling. The small metal eyelet touched my fingers no more than once before I heard something more. A deep, guttural breath. I froze again, but this time in a more awkward position, with one arm raised, supporting myself like a tripod. The breathing turned into a snuffle, then a snort. It was then sniffing and coming closer to the horrifyingly thin and flimsy, half-centered, thick fabric separating me from whatever creature was out there. Whether it be a bear, a wolf, whatever. I began to shake all over. Then I heard a laugh. It was deep, but for that shining moment, I knew it must be my dad trying to scare me. I became relieved, hysterical, and furious all at once. I ripped the zipper down, pulled up the flap, shrieked and peed myself, and started screaming some more. The thing I saw standing outside, the black and shadowed hole of my meager shelter, was without a doubt not my dad. It was hunching over my tent entrance, standing on two legs. It was covered in fur. I couldn't tell the color in the dark, but its eyes were. Its eyes were definitely enormous. If I had to guess and try to put a color to it, it definitely had some sort of amber tint to it. The wolf-like head pulled its thick lips back with enormous fangs showing. Its pointed ears flattened against the back of its skull. It began to growl, sending ripples of sharp panic through the trembling body of myself. Me screaming intensified and got louder. One long, hairy arm began to reach out through the opening of my tent, a grasping, clawed hand reaching ever closer. A loud, sudden gunshot rang out, followed immediately by a cracking sound a little ways down the creature's right. The beast whirled to its left so fast I swear it was a blur. Now I could see its back. A long, fluffy tail spouted out from the end of the beast's spine. I saw its foot enter my field of view, and saw that it was anatomically very similar to a wolf's. Then I heard my dad start yelling, and another gunshot rang out. The creature again moved so fast I could barely see it. Within a split second, it was gone into the branches of the woods. My dad ran over to my tent, looked inside for about 1 second to see if I was alive, and then turned back to the forest. His .50 cal revolver still drawn. I had never before seen him look so terrified. I started to cry and ask over and over what the heck that thing was. But I don't think we'll ever know. My parents tell me it was a bear, but I think it was something much different. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and confusion. Ray kept his revolver close at hand, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature. Linda tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in her eyes as well. None of us slept much that night, our ears attuned to every rustle and snap of the forest. By morning, the fear had given way to a sense of unreality. Had it really happened? Had we really seen a creature that defied explanation? We packed up camp in a hurry, the usual leisurely routine replaced by a frantic urgency to leave the park. The beauty of the landscape, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt ominous and foreboding. As we drove back to Fairview, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The image of the creature was burned into my mind, its amber eyes and sharp fangs haunting my thoughts. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it had been a bear or some other animal, but the memory was too vivid, too real. I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't anything I could easily explain away. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal life, but the experience had changed me. I was more cautious, more aware of the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. I found it hard to sleep, the memory of that night replaying in my mind whenever I closed my eyes. My parents tried to reassure me, but I could see that they were struggling with their own doubts and fears. I never told anyone else about what happened that night. I didn't want to be ridiculed or dismissed as a child with an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something extraordinary, something that defied explanation, It was a secret I would carry with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of the mysteries that still exist in the world. As I grew older, the memory of that night became less vivid, but it never completely faded. It was a defining moment in my childhood, a brush with the unknown that left a lasting impression on me. I became more interested in the supernatural and unexplained, seeking out stories and accounts of other encounters with mysterious creatures. I found comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone, that others had experienced similar things. Even now, as an adult, I still think about that night in Glacier National Park. It was a moment of terror and wonder, a glimpse into a world that lies just beyond our understanding. It taught me to be cautious, to respect the power and mystery of nature, but it also filled me with a sense of awe and curiosity. The world is a strange and wondrous place, full of secrets waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, those secrets come to us in the most unexpected ways. Camping is more than just a hobby for me. It's a passion, a lifeline. There's something profoundly freeing about leaving the hustle and bustle of everyday life behind and immersing myself in nature. The peace and solitude I find out there are unparalleled. Of course, I enjoy camping with friends from time to time, but nothing compares to the experience of camping alone. It's just me, the fire I built, and the sounds of the wild keeping me company until I drift off to sleep. The thrill of solo camping comes with its own set of challenges and, yes, some pretty terrifying moments. Nature has a way of reminding you just how small and vulnerable you are. I've had bears sniff and bat at my tent, and let me tell you, nothing keeps you up for the rest of the night quite like hearing a bear trying to figure out what you are. I've learned not to keep any food inside my tent to avoid attracting animals, but the fear still lingers in the back of my mind every time I hear a rustle or a snap in the underbrush. But as scary as animals can be, nothing compares to the fear of encountering another person in the middle of nowhere. Human footsteps are unmistakable, different from any animal. I've only had it happen twice, but each time left me shaken. The first time, it was just passing footsteps on the grass. They didn't linger, but the mere presence of someone nearby was enough to send chills down my spine. The second time was worse. Someone stopped and waited, just 20 feet from my tent. I held my breath, listening to my heart pound in my chest, until they finally walked away. However, about a month ago, I had the scariest camping experience of my life. It was a crisp October evening, and I had decided to spend the weekend at Lake Serene, a secluded spot about 2 hours from my home in Portland, Oregon. The lake is surrounded by dense forest, and it's the perfect place to disconnect and recharge. I set up my camp on the eastern shore, where the morning sun would greet me with its warmth. The first night was perfect. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal of beans and hot dogs, and settled down with a book. The air was cool, and the sky was a canvas of stars. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. Little did I know, that peace was about to be shattered. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I couldn't figure out what had roused me from my sleep. Then I heard it, footsteps, approaching my tent. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves. My heart began to race. I lay there, frozen, listening as the footsteps grew closer and closer. They stopped right in front of the entrance to my tent. My mind was racing. Who could it be? A lost hiker? A park ranger? Or worse, someone with bad intentions? I had no way of knowing, and the uncertainty was paralyzing. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, my eyes fixed on the zipper of the tent door. The only thing that came to mind was my handgun. I always bring it with me when I go camping, just in case. I knew I needed it now. As quietly as I could, I reached into my open backpack, feeling around through the clothing and gear until my fingers wrapped around the handle of the gun. I pulled it out and held it tightly, my eyes never leaving the tent door. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of the zipper being slowly pulled down. Whoever was out there was trying to be quiet, but in the stillness of the night, every sound was amplified. Panic surged through me. This was no time for assumptions. I needed to make sure I wasn't about to become a statistic. I cocked my gun, the click loud in the silence. The person outside stopped unzipping the tent. I could almost hear them breathing, summoning all the courage I had. I choked out the words, "If you open that, you're dead." "I have a gun." There was a moment of silence, then the person bolted. I've never heard anyone run so fast in my life. The footsteps faded into the distance, and I was left there, trembling, with the gun still clutched in my hand. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for the first light of dawn. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed up my camp and got the hell out of there. The drive back to Portland was a blur. My mind was racing with 100 different thoughts. Who was that person? What were they doing out there? And what would have happened if I hadn't had my gun? Back in the safety of my apartment, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, each time feeling a fresh wave of fear and relief. I was grateful to be alive, but I knew that night had changed me. It had shown me just how vulnerable I was, but also how strong I could be in the face of danger. Despite the terror, I knew I couldn't give up camping. The fear was part of what made it so exhilarating. It reminded me that life is unpredictable and that you have to be prepared for anything. So, I started taking extra precautions. I upgraded my gear, took a self-defense class, and made sure to always let someone know where I was going and when I planned to return. In the late spring of 2009, I finally embarked on a camping trip that had been 2 years in the making. This wasn't just any camping trip. It was a long-anticipated adventure out west, where I would be camping with firearms for the first time. The excitement had been building for months, and the thought of experiencing the raw beauty of the wilderness with the added thrill of target shooting had me buzzing with anticipation. The journey to the campsite was an adventure in itself. Driving through the vast landscapes of the American West was like stepping into another world. I watched as the urban sprawl of my hometown slowly gave way to rolling plains and towering mountains. Each mile brought a new sense of freedom and exhilaration. I made a point to stop at every scenic overlook, every historical marker, taking in the sights and learning about the rich history of the land I was traversing. As I drove, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the natural beauty surrounding me. The sky seemed to stretch on forever, a vast expanse of brilliant blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. The air was crisp and clean, a refreshing change from the smog and noise of the city. The landscape was a tapestry of colors and textures, with rolling hills covered in lush green grass, rocky outcrops jutting out like ancient sentinels, and dense forests that seemed to beckon me with their mystery. When I finally arrived at my destination, a remote part of the Sierra Nevada mountains, I parked my truck and took a moment to appreciate the sheer beauty of the place. The air was filled with the scent of pine and earth, the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was a symphony of nature that soothed my soul and made me feel truly alive. I pulled out my phone to notify my contact, an old friend named Rick who had helped me plan this trip, that I had arrived safely. Rick was an experienced outdoorsman, and his advice had been invaluable. We went over my agenda one last time. and with a final word of encouragement from him, I began the long hike to my campsite. The hike was serene and uneventful. I moved at a leisurely pace, soaking in the sights and sounds of the forest. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, birds singing, insects buzzing, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The weather was perfect, and by the time I reached my campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I set up my tent and built a fire, the crackling flames providing a comforting glow as darkness fell. The freedom I felt, being out there with no one around, was refreshing. It was a stark contrast to the restrictions and noise of life back home. That night, I slept under the stars, the fire keeping me warm and the sounds of the forest lulling me to sleep. The following day unfolded much like the first. I continued my exploration, marveling at the wildlife that seemed to thrive in this untouched corner of the world. Deer grazed peacefully in the meadows, squirrels chattered from the treetops, and I even caught sight of a fox darting through the underbrush. The natural beauty was breathtaking, and I felt a deep sense of connection to the earth. Around midday, I stumbled upon a perfect spot to set up camp. A quick scan of the area confirmed my choice. I unpacked my gear, set up my tent, and soon had a small fire going. As I cooked my lunch, a sense of contentment washed over me. This was exactly what I had been dreaming of. After lunch, feeling a bit drowsy, I decided it was time to do some shooting. I had brought along my SKS rifle and a box of 7.62mm rounds. About 300 yards from my camp, I found a dry creek bed that seemed like the safest place to set up my targets. I arranged a few steel targets and started shooting. The exhilaration I felt was indescribable. The sharp crack of the rifle, the smell of gunpowder, the satisfying clang as the bullets hit the targets. It was all incredibly thrilling. For a moment, I imagined this was what the mountain men must have felt like, living off the land and embracing the wilderness. As I was reloading my SKS, the sound of gunshots echoed through the hills around me. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. The shots continued as I made my way through the forest, and it soon became clear that there were multiple guns being fired. This realization made me uneasy. I had hoped to be alone out here, and the thought of encountering other armed individuals was unsettling. I opted to return to my camp, a decision I still reflect on with mixed feelings of regret and relief. Back at camp, I considered my dinner options. The shooting had stopped shortly after I returned, and I assumed the other shooters had moved on. I spent the next hour cleaning my guns, a calming ritual that helped me unwind. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I decided on a simple meal of crackers and bacon-flavored easy cheese. The simplicity of the meal suited the rustic surroundings. The forest grew quiet as night fell, and I crawled into my tent for an early night. The tranquility was short-lived. Sometime after midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise outside my tent. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. Nothing. Convinced it was just a dream, I lay back down. But just as I closed my eyes, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, more chilling than the cry of a predator killing its prey. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. The scream came again, this time followed by a woman's desperate plea for help. The sound cut through the night, leaving me paralyzed with fear. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The direction of the screams was the same as the gunshots earlier. Instinctively, I reached for my rifle, but common sense prevailed. Charging into the dark, unknown territory against possibly multiple armed assailants was a death wish. I remained in my tent, listening in horror as another scream echoed through the forest, followed by a single, ominous gunshot. The silence that followed was deafening. I lay there, unable to move, my thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and helplessness. What was I supposed to do? The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I felt a surge of urgency. I packed my gear in record time, driven by a primal need to escape. The sense of freedom and empowerment I had felt just a day earlier was replaced by a desperate desire to return to the safety of civilization. The hike back to my truck, which had taken me a leisurely day and a half on the way in, was now a frantic race against time. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent me spinning around, my rifle gripped tightly in my hands. My mind conjured images of shadowy pursuers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached my truck, the sun had set once again, and I was exhausted but relieved. I wasted no time in starting the engine and heading for home. As I drove away, the initial relief began to fade, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. I had heard a woman in desperate need of help, and I had done nothing. The drive home was a torment of conflicting emotions. One moment, I berated myself for being a coward. The next, I rationalized that charging into the darkness against unknown assailants would have been foolish. For days, I was haunted by the sounds of those screams and the single gunshot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed in some fundamental way. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently. The sense of guilt and shame was overwhelming. It was a heavy burden to carry, and it weighed on me constantly. Eventually, I summoned the courage to seek out the truth about what had happened. I reached out to local authorities, hoping to find some closure. What I discovered was both horrifying and somewhat relieving. The area where I had camped was a known hangout for an outlaw biker gang. They had abducted a female backpacker and, after abusing her for hours, had set her free only to shoot her as she tried to escape. Miraculously, she had survived and managed to find help. The bikers were apprehended and faced justice. Learning the truth didn't erase the guilt I felt, but it provided some context. I hadn't been imagining the danger, and my decision to stay put had likely saved my life. Yet, the knowledge that I had been so close to such horror left an indelible mark on my soul. The wilderness, once a place of solace and freedom, now held a darker, more sinister edge. In the aftermath, I kept the incident to myself, choosing not to share it with anyone. The shame and guilt were mine to bear, and I couldn't bring myself to burden others with my story. Instead, I poured my energy into my work and other hobbies, trying to distract myself from the haunting memories. But the lesson I learned was profound. It's a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of life and the importance of vigilance, even in the most seemingly peaceful settings. And it's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, both mine and the woman who survived such unimaginable terror. I've always found solace in the great outdoors. Growing up in a small town in Vermont, I was surrounded by the beauty of nature, which instilled in me a deep appreciation for the wilderness. After moving to Colorado for work, I made it a point to explore the stunning landscapes around me as often as I could. There's something about being in nature that makes me feel truly alive. Perhaps it's the fresh air, the quiet solitude, or the simple act of disconnecting from the chaos of everyday life. One particular weekend, I decided to go camping in the backcountry near Boulder. I'm not much of a hardcore hiker, so I tend to stick to trails that are relatively short, no more than a mile or two. This particular trail was just over a mile from the campsite to the trailhead where my car was parked. It was a secluded spot by a lake, perfect for a quiet weekend getaway. I had been there since Friday, and by Sunday, I was planning to stay for another 2 nights. The weather was perfect, crisp mornings, warm afternoons, and cool evenings. I spent my mornings hiking and my afternoons fishing by the lake. The peacefulness of the place was exactly what I needed to recharge my batteries. On the 3rd day, I decided to hike back to my truck to grab my fishing rod and some extra food. The hike was uneventful, and I enjoyed the familiar sounds of nature. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. When I returned to my campsite, I was surprised to see another tent set up at the far end of the lake. It was an odd sight. The tent was positioned near the water's edge, in a spot that wasn't particularly scenic or practical for camping. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail that morning, so I wondered how they had arrived. Maybe there was another path I wasn't aware of, but it still felt strange. I shrugged it off and set up my fishing rod, casting my line into the clear, cool water. Every now and then, I glanced over at the other tent, but I never saw anyone come or go. After about 3 hours, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I decided to pack up my rod and head back to my tent. I prepared a simple meal of instant noodles and canned beans, the kind of fare that tastes better when you're surrounded by nature. As I ate, I collected some sticks and stones to make a fire pit. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As soon as I lit the campfire, I saw a shadow move in the forest ahead of me. The figure was just far enough away that the light didn't reach them, and after a quick glimpse, they vanished into the darkness. I assumed it was the person from the other tent, possibly gathering sticks for their own fire. It was strange that they were so close to my campsite just as I lit my fire, but I decided not to overthink it. I leaned back in my camping chair, gazing at the fire, the sky, and the lake. The crackling flames and the sounds of the forest were soothing, and I almost drifted off to sleep in the chair. Just as I was about to call it a night, I looked past the fire and saw several figures emerging from the forest. My heart skipped a beat as I counted 4 men, all walking towards my campsite. They appeared to be in their 30s or 40s, with straight faces and a determined gait. I tried to suppress the nervous feeling rising in my chest, hoping they were just fellow campers in need of assistance. When they came into the light, I could see their expressions more clearly, stoic, almost menacing. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I stood up from my chair, trying to maintain a calm demeanor as I addressed them. "Hey, do you guys need something?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. They didn't respond. Instead, 2 of them walked around me and headed straight for my tent, while the other 2 pushed me aside. Panic surged through me, but I knew that fighting back would only make things worse. I watched helplessly as the 2 men rummaged through my belongings, tossing things aside carelessly. The other 2 men continued to push me further away from the campsite, their grip firm and unyielding. I tried to talk to them, to reason with them, but their eyes were cold and empty. They didn't care about what I had to say. "Please, just take what you want and leave me alone," I pleaded, my voice shaking with fear. But they didn't stop. They kept pushing and dragging me further into the forest, away from the light of the campfire and into the growing darkness. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do to me, and I felt a surge of desperation. After what felt like an eternity, we stopped. We were deep in the forest now, the campfire a distant glow through the trees. One of the men reached into his pocket, and instinctively, I bolted. Adrenaline fueled my legs as I ran through the forest, branches scratching at my skin and the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I focused on the general direction of the trail, hoping to find my way back to my truck. When I finally stumbled onto the path, I ran as fast as I could, my breath ragged and my heart pounding. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, scrambling inside and locking the doors. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. I had never been so scared in my life. Once I composed myself, I drove to the nearest town and went straight to the police station. I filed a report detailing everything that had happened. The officers were sympathetic, but I could tell they were skeptical. They assured me they would investigate, but I knew the chances of finding those men were slim. The next day, I returned to the campsite with a police escort to retrieve what was left of my belongings. My tent had been ransacked, and most of my gear was gone. It was clear that the men had no intention of leaving anything behind. The officers searched the area but found no clues as to who they were or where they had gone. The experience left me deeply shaken. The forest, which had once been a place of solace and peace, now felt like a place of danger and fear. I couldn't bring myself to go camping again for a long time, the memory of that night haunting my thoughts. I often wondered what the men had planned for me if I hadn't escaped. The thought was too terrifying to dwell on for long, but it served as a stark reminder of how vulnerable we can be in the wilderness. It took time, but eventually, I began to reclaim my love for the outdoors, always with a heightened sense of caution and awareness.